Well, good morning, everyone. This is Jeff Nunley with South Texas Cotton and Grain. Welcome to the quarterly weather update with Jeff Lindner that's hosted by South Texas Cotton and Grain. I'm recording this and we'll be posting it up on our YouTube channel for those that are interested in going back and looking at it later. If you're on, please mute your microphone so we don't have any interruptions in this. And I will turn it over to Jeff.
All right, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. So we're going to take a look at the forecast going out through next month, November, through the first month of 2025, January. Usually we do this a little bit earlier, and it's usually October through December, but we pushed it back a month, or we pushed it back a little bit this year, mainly due to the hurricane activity. I was in Florida post Helene there for a little bit, so that kind of pushed us back a little bit. But this is the rainfall departures from normal year to date. So this is January 1 through the second or third week of October this year. And you can see we still have a semblance of our very wet spring and summer in southeast and east Texas. So this was a function of the big flooding and rains we had in May and even into parts of June. I don't know how many people know this or not, but Lake Livingston back in May released more water through their floodgates than they did during Harvey back in 2017. So they had record releases on Lake Livingston into the Trinity River back in May. So very wet in this area. And then, of course, we had Hurricane Beryl come up and move across kind of that same area from about Matagorda County up through Houston and then kind of northeast towards Texarkana in July, right around the 4th of July period. And then we've seen the weather kind of turn drier with the exception of kind of deep South Texas. And so from Corpus Christi southward, you actually had some rain. You're one of the only places in the state that's actually had a little bit of rain here as we've gotten into late summer and early fall. Some of that has been from the tropics. We had Francine off the coast, and then that made landfall in Louisiana that was able to produce some rainfall down around the Brownsville and Port Isabel areas. And then in the last few weeks, that area has been in this deep easterly flow across the Gulf of Mexico, which has really kept most of Texas dry. But that flow coming across the Gulf into deep South Texas from the east has been able to produce some showers and thunderstorms down there. So those folks down there are actually enjoying a little bit of rainfall in the current pattern we're in. So I wanted to take a look at kind of where we were this summer. So this is July 30th. This is kind of after all of our big spring rains and also Beryl and Alberto, which started off the tropical season in Texas. And you can see here the drought conditions. We had virtually no droughts in coastal Texas, southeast Texas, east Texas. We still had this area out here northwest of San Antonio that has persistently been in drought for several years now. Kind of this I-35 Austin, San Antonio, northwest towards Kerrville. That area just has not really seen a lot of improvement. And then as we go forward to what was released a couple days ago, the drought monitor, you can see significant degradation in the drought categories across a large portion of the state. You can see that area around Austin, San Antonio expanding. A large portion of moderate drought now from northeast Texas down to the coastal bend, Corpus Christi, and then west toward the Rio Grande. And then even just recently this week, the expansion of the severe drought here in areas around College Station. We're still doing relatively well down here in the lower Rio Grande Valley and even in the Corpus Christi over towards Laredo area. We're starting to get a normally dry. The concern is this can kind of trickle off and go in a bad direction relatively quick. October is a wet month for us in Texas. And we've had zero rainfall in a lot of areas. So Victoria and areas to the north and west of that up towards the Houston area, we've had absolutely no rainfall in the month of October. And that is going to quickly worsen the drought conditions. On top of that, it's been warm. We're talking temperatures in October, early mid-October in the 90s, upper 90s even. And so that's a little bit unusual for us. And that's helping to dry out the soil moisture. And so this is the KBDI values for the state of Texas. So 0 would be completely saturated, muddy conditions. 800 is kind of a theoretical number where there's no moisture in the soil down to 8 inches deep. And so, you don't really ever get to that. There's always, some moisture in the soil. I think the closest we've ever seen those values is around 795 ish, was back in 2011 around Bastrop. Of course, we all know what happened around the Bastrop area with the fire in that year. And so this is really a kind of a fire weather index. And it also gives you an idea of how your grasses and your fuels are doing. So when you start talking values of 5 to 600, 650, your grasses are going to start to suffer. That's when you start to see those the grasses start to die and cure, and readily be available for fire. And then as you start to move into the 700s and plus, you start to get into what we call the ladder fuels, your brush, and stuff like that. And then even into some trees. And we've had some issues recently with juniper and pine in East Texas and back into Central Texas. And you can see these values here between 7 and 800. Kind of the northern coastal bend, Lavaca County, Colorado County, back over towards Fayette County, maybe getting down into Wharton County. But again, this kind of wet-ish summer and then wet fall here, early fall in the South Texas, has really helped with the vegetation health down in this area and the fire weather concerns. But again, we're moving in a direction that's not our friend in some of these areas. So these are the current burn bans. A lot of burn bans in place, except for Calhoun, Refugio, and Aransas counties. And then back a little bit further out to the west and the south, not as many in place. But I suspect we've seen this almost double in the last month or so. So as conditions continue to go downhill with the drought conditions, I suspect more burn bans will be coming out. The other issue we get into this time of year, we haven't really had it yet, but it's coming, is cold fronts. And so we start getting these big cold fronts down through here with very dry air masses. We're talking north wind 20, 30 miles an hour, maybe gusting to 40. You put that over these dried fuel loads, and that can really result in some aggressive fire behavior. So we haven't had to deal with it yet, but unfortunately, we're moving to that time of year where we're going to start getting increasing amounts of frontal systems through here with those conditions that favor fire weather. All right, so let's take a look at maybe some of the drivers here. We talked about sea surface temperatures for the Atlantic hurricane season, which has been a little bit of an underperformer with respect to the numbers, how many storms we were expecting, but it has certainly been an impactful season, especially on the Gulf Coast of the U.S. 5 hurricanes making landfall on the U.S. Gulf Coast, 3 in Florida, 1 in Louisiana, and of course 1 in Texas with Beryl. And this was the sea surface temperature pattern we saw in January of 24. So we had a fairly decent El Nino in place. This likely resulted, at least in some degree, in our wet late spring and early summer. And then that El Nino declined, and it has been declining fairly rapidly. And we've kind of evolved into this La Nina pattern. We're right on the threshold of La Nina. It's been a little bit slower to come along and develop. Probably that has helped us a little bit on the Atlantic hurricane season. We had, very few storms in the month of August, which I think really helped us out here in Texas. Very few storms even in the early part of September. Again, August and September tend to be our big months here in Texas. And so the lack of activity during that period really kind of saved us, if you will, here in Texas. Unfortunately, we've seen kind of a backloaded season. We've had a lot of hurricanes in late September and October, possibly even seeing another hurricane in the Caribbean next week. And so that gives you some idea that La Nina and the atmospheric response is finally taking over, and we're starting to see more favorable conditions in the Atlantic for hurricanes. But this is also, as we've talked about before, La Nina tends to support southern plains and Texas drought. And as this La Nina has continued to develop, the weather pattern here in Texas has become increasingly dry. We started to notice in August timeframe a below average number of rainfall in the state of Texas. That intensified a little bit in September. It has really just dropped off the cliff completely in October. Very little rain has occurred across the state in October. And so we're seeing this pattern evolve. One thing I will point out is this warm, very warm water up here east of Japan and south of the Aleutian Islands. This has been sort of a common theme with La Nina unless when we've had La Nina patterns over the last decade or so, as we've seen the cool water near the equator, and then we've had this what we call this North Pacific warm pool up here south of the Aleutian Islands. And this is something to keep an eye on and watch because this could help build high pressure over this portion of the northern Pacific and build that up into the Arctic Ocean. And if you get high pressure building up over Alaska during the winter, that tends to unlock the potential for Arctic air to come down the central plains and the east of the Rockies. And so while the general pattern going through our late fall, winter, and even into early spring is likely warmer than normal, we could definitely see some outbreaks of significant cold. Now, these tend to be short lived, 2, 3, 4 days at the most, but they could be pretty brutal. And if you go back and historically look at significant Arctic air outbreaks in comparison to La Nina, there's a little bit of a correlation there. Some big La Nina winters end up with really big cold air outbreaks in the southern plains. And so we'll have to keep an eye on that, and we'll have to keep an eye on how this warm water here south of the Aleutians evolves as we get into the winter months. And so you can see here the Pacific sea surface temperatures for each one of the Nino regions. This is not a strong La Nina. This is not a 2010, 11 type La Nina pattern, kind of just creeping toward that La Nina phase. And so that kind of puts some interesting, forecast in here is how significant is this really going to be this winter? The pattern we've kind of transitioned into in October is more representative of a moderate or strong La Nina. I mean, we've just completely shut down rainfall altogether in the southern plains, but that doesn't mean it's going to continue. And there's already some indications as we get into next week, and maybe into the first part of November, of a little bit more moisture in the state of Texas as we start getting fronts down here. And so this is the forecast for sea surface temperatures in the Nino regions. And you can see going down towards La Nina, there's probably 60% or so of these models that show the water cooling below the half a degree that we need to consider a full La Nina. There's some that keep it kind of just at or above that threshold, and so kind of in that normal range. But nothing getting down here towards, a couple down here towards the -1, nothing down towards the -1.5. So this is when you start talking strong stuff as you start getting, below the one. So we'll have to see how this plays out, but this may help a little bit in the southern plains in Texas that it's just not incredibly dry as we go through fall and into winter. And this is a look at the impacts for the months of October, November, and December. The top graphs here are precipitation in La Nina phases for October, November, December. And so the first thing that stands out is it pops very clearly here in Louisiana, Southeast Texas, kind of the Arklatex area, this significant dry anomaly that's showing up. You're talking anomalies anywhere from 70 to 90% below average of what we would expect on the rainfall wise. So, that's the first thing that really stands out. And then the second thing is how common is that over here on this chart? So this is how common that would be. You're talking the chances of below average rainfall in these dark areas here, anywhere from 70 to say 80%. And so, so far this is playing out very well. Interestingly enough, if you look at the temperatures, we always think of La Nina as warm. If you look at the anomalies, it's not overly warm. And you can see here, this is historically what has happened in the past for these months. So yes, it's warmer than normal, but it's not screaming hot, like potentially some of the charts further along I'm going to show you. So this is interesting that this kind of pops up as maybe more near average temperatures or just slightly above normal. And there's no big percentages here showing up in Texas for that. So I think the takeaway always kind of with La Nina in October, November, December, it's much more of a dry factor for us sometimes than a temperature factor. And so we'll step through each one of the models. So this is the American long range model for November to January. And as you can see, you're going to see a lot of this below normal precipitation in the state of Texas. Interestingly enough, it does have this kind of near normal precipitation here across the hill country. That's probably more in the December, January time period than November. And we'll see, all of these models were showing a dry October, but they were nowhere near dry enough. And so, the fact that we're running anywhere from 2 to 4 inches behind normal for October of this year, these models are showing more around an inch to an inch and a half below normal. So I have a little bit of a concern they might be underdoing the dryness a little bit. And you can just see the other issue we have here is a dry Gulf of Mexico. So it's kind of hard to get moisture in here in Texas when the Gulf of Mexico is also really dry. So this is the European model. It is not as aggressive with the dryness. It sort of still has the pattern, but it has a little bit more of a normal rainfall pattern here in the southern plains in Texas. So we'll see. That's a possibility there. And this is the Canadian, which is much similar to the American model with dryness across the state and the Gulf of Mexico. And you put them all together for the average, and the precipitation average for November through January for the southern plains of Texas is generally below normal. So we'll see how significant this is. I think it's probably going to be a little bit more significant than what this is showing here, just based on what we've seen. But it doesn't mean it's not going to rain, and that's the important part. We are likely to see some episodes of rainfall. The question is, how much do we get? Are we talking we're going to get a quarter of an inch with the front, just enough to kind of keep the dust down and wet the topsoil a little bit? Or do we get, a widespread 1 to 2 inch rain once a month? If we can get those widespread 1 to 2 inches on a day or two each month, that will really help with beating back the drought and the fire weather, because obviously the temperatures are going to be cooling off too. So we're not seeing as much evaporation. If we're not able to generate that, and we go a month or 6 weeks or 8 weeks really without any rainfall, and that's kind of the case we're in right now for a lot of areas. If we continue that, drought is going to develop very, very quickly here, and we're going to see a lot of degradation. So this is the NOAA official outlook. So you can see below normal precipitation, anywhere from 60 to 70% chance of below normal across the southwestern half of Texas. A little bit off to the north and east, those chances are around 40-50%. So again, kind of matching with what the guidance is showing, with below normal precipitation through the month or through the fall and into the winter. No surprise on temperatures. Warm. We've been generally above average. October has been way above average with the continuation of the heat. And this continues on into November and January. So again, this is the American model. This is the European, which differed a little bit on the precipitation. It does show the heat. Interestingly enough, the European does show kind of this possible indication of that warm pool we talked about in the North Pacific, with near normal temperatures up here in Western Canada into the northern Rockies. And so this could be an area we need to keep an eye on for any Arctic air that develops, especially if this starts to trend below normal. If this starts to trend below normal, you can get those Arctic air masses coming down east of the Rockies. So even though your monthly temperature is likely to be above normal, you can get a couple days where it gets really cold down here in the southern plains of Texas. The Canadian also warm. Interestingly enough, it does show some below normal temperatures here near the Canadian border. This is somewhat normal of a La Nina pattern. And then the multi-model consensus is generally warm. Not as hot across the southern plains, but still above average as we go through the months. And you can see the Climate Prediction Center seasonal outlook with well above normal temperatures into West Texas and the southern plains. Anywhere from 50, a good 50 to 60% chance, and then much warmer out here to the west. Some hints here in Alaska. I mean, we kind of mentioned about this. If I were looking for a big cold air dump down into the U.S., I'd be looking for above normal temperatures in Alaska. So typically, Alaska is warm when the cold air comes south into the United States, and so you don't really necessarily see that here. But again, this was muted out over a 3-month period or so. And so there could be periods here as we get into December and January where Alaska does warm up a little bit. So no surprise, the drought outlook through the end of January, where we already have drought, is going to persist. Where we do not have drought, especially in South Texas, south of Corpus, out towards the Laredo area, we're likely to see drought develop. We're also likely to see drought develop across the Trans-Pecos area, the northern hill country, back up towards the Lubbock area. That area did see some rain in September with a stalled front, and so it kind of helped with the drought in that area. So we are likely to see drought develop across really most of the state of Texas, probably most of the southern U.S., the lower Mississippi Valley, all the way over into Alabama, Mississippi. It's been extremely dry in Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama. They've been on the west side of kind of the hurricane tracks going up over Florida and Georgia. And so this is a pretty common scene here for La Nina drought in the Southwest, Southern Plains, Southern U.S. And then we do have a lot of drought ongoing right now in the Central and Northern Plains, and that's likely to just stay in place with a general lack of rainfall across that area. As a matter of fact, if you look at the October precipitation rankings for the United States as a whole, it is coming in as the second driest October on record for the entire United States. The number one driest was October of 1952, which was in that multi-year drought that started in Texas and up to the Central Plains, started in 1951 and went through 1957. And so, we're sort of rivaling some of our really dry periods here in the United States with lack of rainfall from kind of coast to coast. The exception has been Florida and the Southeast with the tropics that have been kind of pushed down in that far southeastern portion of the United States. All right, so the outlook, weak to moderate La Nina developing. That tends to support below normal rainfall in Texas. The question is, are we talking significantly below normal rainfall? Or are we talking, 1 to 2 inches below normal? Just looking at what has happened in October is really concerning. October is one of our wettest months. We've been able to generate very little rainfall north of the Lower Rio Grande Valley, and so it's definitely concerning that we've just been able to generate such little rainfall in the month of October. Our averages tend to trend downward as we get into November, December, and January, especially in South Texas. And so that really, again, becomes the question: are we able to get 1 to 2 inches a month? I think that's the best case scenario. Hopefully, we can look for. The worst case scenario is we don't get any rainfall, or we get very little rainfall, and we continue to sink deeper and deeper into drought. Temperatures generally above normal. We'll see how the cold fronts evolve. So far, we've had very few frontal passages. I think we had what I would call a significant front in mid-October that actually brought lows down into the 50s and 60s from up to South Texas and upper 40s up around the Victoria area. But since then, we have not had, really many frontal passages through the state. And so we'll see how this goes. I do suspect the temperatures will be above average, generally speaking. But it's always on the table that there could be a period of very cold air come down. This is very common in La Nina winters. 2021 was a La Nina winter. We had a big cold air outbreak. 2011, January of 2011, of course, the big drought of 2011, strong La Nina, we had a significant cold air outbreak. And then, of course, you get back into the 80s, 89 and 83, both La Nina situations. And we had probably some of the worst cold air outbreaks we've ever had in Texas in 1989 and 1983 December. So we'll have to keep an eye on it. This isn't anything we can look ahead at this point and say Arctic air is definitely coming to Texas, at some point. It can happen. There are La Nina winters where it does not happen. But there likely is some influence from that warm water there south of the Aleutian Islands. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. That was something we did have in place in 2021 and also back in 2011 where we had our Arctic air come down from the north. And we are going to be transitioning. It's kind of the tale of two cities there in South Texas. You have decent rainfall down in South Texas. You have some soil moisture down in that area. And then as you go northward towards the Corpus and Victoria areas, things get much worse. And so it's kind of opposite of normal. Normally it's driest down in deep South Texas and along the Rio Grande. But those tropical influences late this summer and into early fall have really helped down in the lower valley to help keep that soil moisture in place and have some rainfall down there. But as you go northward, things get bad relatively fast. as you get up into the coastal bend and really north of that, up towards the I-10 corridor, things really go downhill. So there likely will not be any recovery in that until we get some precipitation. Again, there's the potential for some precipitation around Halloween into the first week of November. We'll have to see. A front's coming down. We'll just have to see if it has enough moisture to work with. With the Gulf of Mexico kind of shut down, and unfortunately, if we do get a tropical system or hurricane develop in the Western Caribbean again, that produces that northerly flow in the Gulf of Mexico, and so that kind of restricts our moisture coming back into Texas ahead or along of any front, and so that would actually hurt us for rainfall here in Texas. The other thing we're not seeing, even though we have a big hurricane out in the East Pacific right now, Christy, the tropics of the East Pacific have been very quiet, and usually October patterns here, if we have hurricanes out in the East Pacific, those hurricanes can turn back and strike Western Mexico, Baja, those areas, and that moisture comes up across Texas. And we haven't seen really any of that in late September and October. And so, again, pretty much every aspect where we can generate rainfall or get rainfall from in October has been vacant this year. We just haven't seen it. And so that's why we've sunk into the drought conditions we're in. So with that, I'll answer any questions. I know this was kind of short and sweet, and the message probably not what a lot of people wanted to hear here. Looking beyond this, could we see some improvement as we get into spring of next year? A lot of that's just going to depend on how deep we sink into the La Nina pattern. La Nina tends to reach its strongest point in that February-March timeframe. And so we'll have to see how deep we sink into it. The best case scenario is we just barely drop into La Nina, and then we start to recover. The water temperature starts to recover, and maybe we transition more towards a normal weather pattern, whatever that is. And that would help with the rainfall aspect as we get into the early spring months. But, the other concern I have is, and we've seen this before in Texas, once you kind of get into drought, once you dry out the soil, once you get into this process, it's really hard to break, even in the wintertime. And you kind of build high pressure over you. The ground dries out. The drier the ground, the warmer the temperatures, the higher the high pressure. Just all these things work against us to get rainfall in here. Now, in the wintertime, you can still get troughs and fronts that can help push back on that some. But if we don't generate some rain to kind of wet the ground and kind of break the cycle, it's really hard to break. And it's sort of rare to go into it in the fall months. The last time we saw something sort of this magnitude, and we're not quite there yet. I kind of call what we're in right now kind of what we call a flash drought. So we went from extremely wet conditions to extremely dry conditions in a very short period of time. So it's just flash drought. It shocks a lot of the systems that we have out there, especially on the vegetation. So that's why you see the degradation of the vegetation so quickly. The question is, does it turn into a longer term drought? And we saw this back in 2011 or 2010, October of 2010 is when it started getting dry, and then it just didn't rain really for the entire winter. We went into the horrible drought of 2011. And so we're sort of in the same boat right now. La Nina is different, but we're sort of in the same dryness pattern that we were in October of 2010. And so the big question over the next couple of months is, do we get some rain, enough rain to kind of wet the ground and help us out? Or do we transition deeper and deeper into drought? And that's not what we want to see, because we do not want to go into the spring months and the temperatures warming in a really bad drought situation. Any questions?